Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Today is day 2 of the reading challenge, and I would like to take a minute. Take a few minutes to complete the reading for today. Today I'll be reading again from Everyday Economics, but I'll be reading on the size and the composition of deficits. I looked at yesterday's video and I noticed that there was a complete lack of eye contact based on the placement of the camera. So I'm hoping that the changes that I've made today will improve that. The size and the composition of deficits, like we were talking about yesterday. This shows table 2, which I cannot show you right now, shows the trends in the central government's deficits expressed as a percentage of the GDP. Over the number of years, the Fiscal Deficit Responsibility and Budget Management Act, or FRBM, of 2003 has mandated the central government's fiscal deficit and revenue deficit as a percentage of the GDP. This must come down to 3% to 0%, respectively, by 2008 or 2009. The trend up to 2007-2008 clearly showed that the central government did a good job and considerably reduced the deficits. In fact, the fiscal deficit was brought down to below 3% in 2007-2008, and the revenue deficit was only about 41% of the fiscal deficit. This shows that relatively higher amounts were being spent on the asset-creating expenditures. However, the world was hit by a global recession at that time, and India was no exception to it. To avoid the recession, the government had to engage an exceptionary fiscal policy, which once again contributed to the increased percentage of fiscal and revenue deficits in the years of 2007-2008. Repeat. Once again, to avoid this recession, the government had to engage in an exemplary fiscal policy, which once again contributed to an increased percentage of the fiscal and the revenue deficits in the years 2008-2009 and 2009-2010. While we will discuss exemplary fiscal policy, expansionary fiscal policy in the later chapters, it will suffice at this time to say that it involves increasing government expenditure and or reducing taxes to reduce unemployment. An expansionary fiscal policy has to be temporary in nature, and it is desirable that the deficits decrease eventually. In this context, the 13th Finance Commission, under the chairmanship of Dr. Vijay Kelkar, recommended a revised date of 2013-2014 by the end of which the fiscal and revenue deficits should be brought down by 3% and 0% respectively. Brought down to 3% and 0% respectively. However, the prospect of this happening is low for the Indian economy and has not fully recovered from the recession since 2012. In fact, the International Monetary Fund has all along been recommending that the fiscal deficit should not be more than 3% of the GDP. Notice also the last row of the table, which you cannot see at the moment, which I have not because of the reading. The revenue deficit as a percentage of the fiscal deficit has been extremely high in the recent past, averaging about 75%. Such a high percentage of is worrisome, for it tells us the amount of debt that the government is incurring and is being used and what is being used for routine administrative expenditures and will not lead to an asset creation. The deficits of only the central government are reported above. Bigger deficits emerge when deficits of the state governments are included. For example, the combined fiscal revenue and primary deficits of the central government and the state governments for the year 2009-2010 were 9.5% and 5.06%, and lastly 4.29% of India's GDP. Why do economists not look favorably upon the high fiscal deficit? To give an example of a household analogy, one must cut one's coat according to the size of the cloth. However, this argument does not go very far if one argues the government is justified in borrowing to finance asset creating expenditures on dams, roads, and education. The reason why the high fiscal deficit is discouraged lies in the linkage of interest rates, private investments, and foreign trade deficit. Let us try to understand this linkage. When the government's fiscal deficit is large, it implies that the government has to borrow heavily. This means that the demand for loans will rise in the markets, causing interest rates to go up. As the interest rates goes up, the cost of borrowing for private firms goes up. As the cost of the borrowings rises, the firms find that fewer and fewer investment projects are economically viable. Therefore, private firms borrow less and do not invest in new projects. In fact, they get out of some of the existing investments projects, for loans are costly. The fall of the private investments naturally has an adverse impact on the employment generation and income. In economics, this phenomenon is called crowding out of private investments by the public borrowing. There is one more reason why heavy fiscal deficit may have additional adverse effects. It's called ceteris paribus, that is, other things remaining the same. As the government borrows more and more from the credit market, it may even have to borrow from foreign resources. It goes without saying that since the interest rates are high, foreign firms and institutions sense profit opportunities and are happy to fund them forward. As foreign funds start flowing into the country, foreign firms and institutions have to exchange their currency with the Indian rupee. This means that the demand for the Indian rupee goes up and it appreciates. That is, if the exchange rate initially was $1 for 50 Indian rupees, due to the additional demand for rupees by foreigners, the new exchange rate would become, say, $1 for rupees 40. When the rupee appreciates in this manner, the US dollar fetches fewer rupees and therefore the Indian exports become expensive and imports become cheaper. This results in lower exports and higher imports for India, leading to a higher trade deficit for the country. Thus, a high fiscal deficit may lead to a high trade deficit. Of course, one must also remember that the accumulation of fiscal deficits is over time. I'll repeat that. Of course, one must remember that the accumulation of fiscal deficits over time leads to large public debt, both domestic and foreign. PIIGS, which is Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. These countries, that is the PIIGS countries in Europe, have found themselves in a very critical condition on the issue in the recent past. For example, Greece's debt had crossed 142% of the GDP in 2010. And importantly, she was unable to repay the debt and increase payments, leading to disastrous consequences for this economy. I have 4 more minutes, so I think I'll try and continue with the next section. Taxation and fiscal consolidation. The principles of taxation. If governments wish to avoid budget deficits or at least minimize them, it is clear that they have no other option but to tax their people and their firms. Therefore, although taxes are highly unpopular, they become a regrettable necessity for financing the businesses and the government. And this begs the question, which principle should guide the government to collect taxes from society? Unfortunately, there are no one single philosophical principle on the governments that the governments can rely on. First, there is a benefit to provide principle, which shows that people and firms must be taxed in proportion to the benefits they receive from the government. That is, if A uses a toll and 5 times more than B, then A must pay toll which is 5 times the toll paid by B. Second, if the ability to pay principle holds that the taxes which people pay should relate to the income and the wealth. That is, if A has a higher income than B, A should pay higher taxes than B because A's ability to earn and therefore pay is more. Third, the horizontal equity and the vertical equity principles state that those who are equal should be taxed equally, and those who are unequal must be taxed unequally. That is, if A and B have the same income, they should pay the same tax. But if A has a higher income than B, then A should pay more tax than B. These principles essentially focus on the issue of fairness. Finally, yet another principle that is considered is the principle of economic efficiency. It states that taxes should be minimal and the effect of the free market composition and the production decisions. I'll repeat that, the last sentence. It states that taxes should have a minimal effect on the free market consumption and the production decisions. With that, I close today's reading. I thank you for joining me for the reading challenge. Today is day 2. My name is Russell Brown, and I hope you have a wonderful week ahead. Thank you.